Mobile ones as well, if you guys want to use them. Yeah, so there's mobile ones.
Okay.
Okay.
Leave that in. Let's switch off the air conditioners.
Okay.
1, 2. All good.
So firstly, I would like to say thank you very much to the organizers of the Libertarian seminar for inviting us ordinary criminals here today. We had a fantastic drive over the last 2 days from Johannesburg, and it's our first time on the West Coast, and we're loving every minute of it so far. We're really honored to be here. We always start our presentations by getting an idea of our audience. So I'd like to know, by show of hands, how many people don't use Dagga in the room?
Okay.
That is great. That is great. We really don't like preaching to the choir. So, oh no, that's all the same thing. You use
All
it.
the same thing.
That's also Dagga. It's also Dagga.
We'll get onto that.
So now that we've established that, that's really good news. We're not preaching to the choir. For those of you who don't know what Fields of Green for All look like, there we go. Beautiful scene in the Pondoland of our most beloved plant. Our journey to this place where we're standing here today started just over 9 years ago. In 2010, on 5th of August, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the police invaded our home. We were arrested and charged with dealing and possession of Dagga. And, well, the rest is history. And it's been the most phenomenal journey. It really has. It's taken us all over the world. It's been very exciting. And we've met so many awesome, interesting people. That's including all of the people here today, if the conversations we've been having so far are anything to go by. So when we were arrested, we've got to speak about this word, Dagga. Now, we get emails practically every single week. I hate the word Dagga. It sounds so awful. Well, Dagga actually doesn't mean cannabis. Dagga is an ancient Khoi, ancient San word, which means intoxication. And it was bastardized by the authorities who were prohibiting the use of our favorite plant. It was bastardized into the word Dagga to make it sound gaga. So I remember when I used to live in Yeovil back in the old hippie days, behind Checkers in the car park was big spray-painted letters, Dagga is gaga. And that meant that those who prohibited the plant had achieved what they wanted to achieve. So we love the word Dagga.
Viva.
And that is why we are called the Dagga couple. And I'd just like to make an amendment to the program. I'm not the Dagga single here today. We are the Dagga couple. My name's Myrtle, this is Julian, and the name of our organization is Fields of Green for All. And the all on the program should be in capital letters. So continuing on from the word Dagga, we were arrested in our home. We were kept hostage by the police for over 5 hours as they searched and searched and searched for the supposed drug lab that they were looking for, all the time saying to us, "Waar's die fucking lab, waar's die fucking lab?" And we're like, what? It's August, there's not even any weed growing. It's the middle of winter in Joburg. Hello, wake up. So we had basically 3 choices. After getting over the shock of the arrest and the indignation at our treatment at the hands of the police, we could have just admitted our guilt. I mean, they found 1.87 kilograms of Dagga in our house. So we could have admitted this, and we could have just taken our punishment, because at that stage, if you go strictly according to the statutes, we were facing 7 to 10 years in jail. Our second choice was to pay a bribe. This is South Africa, after all. We even inquired about paying a bribe. We phoned some dodgy lawyer, and he said, "You got to put 10,000 Rand into our accounts first before I'll even speak to you." But we knew that if we'd have paid a bribe, they would have been back, because then they would have identified the cash cow. And actually, 8 years on, nearly 9 years on, it would have been much cheaper to pay the bribe, I can tell you. We could have gone back to our lucrative lives in the South African movie and television industry and just carried on as normal. But there was something that just told us that this was a bigger picture. So our third option was to actually change the law. And thanks to our amazing first attorney, whose name was Ferdy Hartzenberg of the great Hartzenberg law dynasty in Pretoria, he said, "You are exactly what we are looking for. You're financially stable, you're middle-aged, you don't have any children, you are perfectly placed to actually change the law." And thus began our journey. So what did we base our whole campaign on? We based it on, again, 3 things. Now, I'd like to say thank you very much to David Stewart for his perfect outlining of what human rights mean. It is our human right to not be persecuted, not be locked up in a cage for something that is not harming us and it's not harming our fellow citizens. So the presumption is that Dagga is dangerous and it is harmful. Now, those presumptions are unscientific, and they're basically just wrong. They do not, as we've already proved, pass constitutional muster, because the evidence for the prohibition of Dagga has never been looked at. So our human rights obviously came first. The second principle that we based our campaign on was this idea of sovereignty. Sovereignty of our bodies, sovereignty of our minds, so just our general sovereignty as human beings who walk this planet. And the third principle that we based our campaign on was this issue of cognitive liberty. Now, cognitive liberty has never been written into law anywhere in the world. And this, we believe, is going to be a great breakthrough when it eventually happens. And there's a chance that some degree of cognitive liberty is going to be written into South African law in the near future. And basically, what cognitive liberty means is that imagine that in your brain you have 2 spaces. One space that is your everyday life of where you eat and sleep and walk and talk and think. And then there's another space in your brain where all sorts of exciting, cognitive, creative things happen. But there's a door between these 2 spaces in your mind. And the government holds the key and refuses to give you this key to use the tools that for your individual needs unlock that door. For us, cannabis is one of the things that unlocks that door into greater perception, greater creativity, not for everybody, but for us as sovereign human beings. And what we want is for the government to give us back that key so that we can explore those areas of our mind that have been locked out by prohibitionist laws.
So we sat on our hands for a long time. It was months and months wondering what to do, because as soon as we heard it was 8 to 10 years, we had to do something. So we wrote an affidavit, and we had it signed by a man who charged us 28,000 Rand for his signature. But it boded well, because we handed the affidavit into the Pretoria High Court in mitigation of our 8 to 10 years. And we charged 8 government departments with enacting an unlawful law. And that was in 2011. And at that point, because we were now in the Pretoria High Court, the press got hold of it. And as we drove to work one morning in Johannesburg, we saw a sign on a robot that says, "Couple fight for Dagga." And we imagined there were 2 people somewhere fighting over a bag of weed somewhere. But when we got to work 15 minutes later, we were on the front page of the Citizen newspaper as a couple who were finally, after 100 years of brutal prohibition, somebody was fighting for the rights of 20 million cannabis users in South Africa. The fight took us to the Pretoria High Court 2 years ago. We billed it as the trial of the plant because we were now the plaintiffs and the government had to answer to us. They were the defendants. And now the government is in the position where they have to prove that their laws are doing what they set out to do, which of course they couldn't. So for 14 days we ran the gauntlet through this lot. And they were paid for by the Department of Social Development, and they were also paid for by one of our detractors, a Christian right-wing fundamentalist group who wrote all the flyers. So it was a very, very intense time, and we had 14 days in court, and basically the state just ground us to a halt. We couldn't ventilate everything we wanted to ventilate, so this court case, the trial of the plant, is still part heard in the Pretoria High Court. However, with the evidence that we got part heard in Pretoria, we managed to put that evidence into, as applicants, into the Constitutional Court last year, and you will see in the center, on the right, there's a man in red. That is Gareth Prince, and to his right, the leader of the Dagga party, Jeremy Acton, had already filed an application in the Western Cape High Court, and Judge Dennis Davis gave them leave to appeal Judge Dennis Davis said they had a constitutional right to use cannabis, but of course the state appealed it immediately, and this is the day of the appeal. So we managed to put all the evidence that we gathered from Fields of Green for All into the mix, and basically that was the day that Judge Zondo stood up, he didn't stand up. He started reading this judgment from a full bench of 10. This is powerful stuff, the Apex Court. And he said, in a unanimous decision, and Myrtle and I just burst into tears, because it would never be a unanimous decision against us. It was a bench of 10 saying, we and you have the constitutional right to use cannabis products in the privacy of your own home. Alrighty, so we have a bunch of very, very young, very dynamic and extremely clever people to thank for that. Schindler's attorneys in Johannesburg took us on pro bono, and for 7 years they've been taking us on pro bono, and we estimate that they have given us over 4 million rands worth of legal advice to get us where we are today. And we are indebted to them, and so is South Africa. Look how young these guys are. They're pioneers, and now they have a completely dedicated cannabis department within Schindler's Incorporated to deal with the next stage of cannabis development in South Africa. Of course, the press went silly, and they got even sillier. This is my favorite, because we believe that it is a gateway drug to saner drug policy within South Africa and the rest of the world. So this is what we've got now. We have got Dagga on our stoop. And everybody that we know in the cannabis community has taken Judge Zondo's advice, and they are overgrowing our government. There is weed everywhere in South Africa now. It is coming out of our ears. Everywhere we go to do a presentation like this, there is cannabis within this town, there is cannabis in that town. It is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as people are coming out into the open. This was September the 18th last year, and on September the 19th last year, everybody woke up to a brand new world, and people started coming out of the closet about their cannabis use. And I screen grabbed this tweet the next morning. Cannabis works in very weird and wonderful ways, ladies and gentlemen, and we don't expect you to get it right the first time. It is a teacher plant, it is an entheogen, and you will learn many, many things about yourself, and of course, with all entheogens on the planet, it is completely dose dependent.
So where did this leave us after the Constitutional Court judgment? it left us feeling relieved to a certain extent, because now, despite not paying the bribe, we know that the police can never come back again and invade our home in the middle of the night. But it also left us with a hell of a lot of work to do. Because, as Julian was saying, there's 20 million cannabis users in South Africa. That's our estimate. And it might even be an underestimate. But all of a sudden, we have every second Tom, Dick, and Harry wanting to get into the cannabis business. But what about those 20 million users, traders, and cultivators that have been doing this for generations? We estimate for about 500 years in Southern Africa. What about us? Is everybody else going to come and overrule how we feel and how we've been doing things for the last 500 years? No, they are not. We are absolutely adamant that there will be nothing about us without us. Now, this particular phrase, it's been used by loads of civil society groups over the ages. It's not ours, but it certainly does apply to cannabis in South Africa, because there's a chance that, particularly with the international interests, that we are going to all be swept aside, and the laws and regulations are still not going to be formulated according to evidence, according to our Constitution. So this is our rallying battle cry. So what we've done, and this has been in the pipeline, we've been working on it for the last 5 years or so, we had to know what we want. And like that old Joe Jackson song, you can't get what you want unless you know what we want. So last year, we went on an extensive countrywide tour called the Desired Outcomes Tour, getting information from the public, from traders, from cultivators, from users on what they want the new laws and regulations to look like. Because if we just stand back and say, okay, now there's a court decision, our work is done, that won't work. The government are going to say, oh, you're only allowed to grow 3 plants. Or, oh, there's only medicine. Or, oh, we can only have CBD, or something like that. So our work has actually stepped up. And this is the draft title of what is going to be civil society in South Africa's manifesto for cannabis regulation. And this is what it's already on the desks of hundreds of different government officials, NGOs, civil society leaders, community groups, and it's been out for public consultation since March last year. And this is the final draft that is going out, hopefully by the end of next week, and then we will raise the money in order to finalize it, get it set out nicely, and actually print it. So we're hoping to take this to the government, for them to consider it as what we want in every single minute detail. This particular document covers everything about cannabis in South Africa. And as I said, with public consultation. So this is a very important aspect of what we do. We're thinking of actually calling it Cannabis in South Africa, a full spectrum model of regulations. And maybe not for the Rainbow Nation, because that's a bit cheesy. So this is a bit of an old slide. But now, it's all very well, okay, this is what we want, but we have to, first of all, create a foundation on which to build the laws and regulations. Now, Transform in the UK are a think tank and a drug policy NGO that have been around for about the last 15 years. And we've got to know them really well by traveling around and meeting them at conferences and seminars. And they brought out a book in 2015 called How to Regulate Cannabis. So I've lifted these basic principles for ethical regulations from Transform. So I'm just crediting them. And they have an awesome website with really, really good resources that have been well thought out. Now, these principles will form the foundation for cannabis regulation, and they are: cannabis has to be regulated in proportion to other psychoactive, stroke intoxicating substances. For example, cannabis has to be regulated in proportion to alcohol. I'm going to get into that in more detail a little bit later. We have to have a degree of certainty, because right now in South Africa, we're sitting in this horrible gray area, because the Constitutional Court have said, right, you have the right to privacy, and you have the right to use and consume cannabis in private spaces, but there's absolutely no certainty. So you just have to look at our inbox of over 100 emails a day. How much weed can I grow? What happens with this? The police are still arresting people. So at the moment in South Africa, there's no certainty. And even amongst the members of this seminar, I can tell you that nobody knows what's going on really. So we have to aim for this certainty with our regulations. But at the same time, we have to be flexible. As civil society, we can't say, okay, we're going to dig our heels in and this is what we want. It has to be a two-way street with the lawmakers, with the government, with the regulators. It has to be a two-way street where both sides need to be a bit flexible, because what we are looking for is a particular South African solution to this problem of cannabis prohibition. So that's where the flexibility comes in. And now we don't want to have to write these laws over and over and over again. These laws have to, and the regulations have to be durable to at least the next 25 or 30 years. So we've got to get it quite right from the beginning. Otherwise, we're going to be rewriting it. And as civil society, we're going to have to go back to court. And we don't really have an appetite for litigation right now. We've been there, done that. So this durability issue is very, very important. Transparency and accountability, little bit of a rare and beautiful thing in South Africa. The way that you get transparency and accountability is making laws and regulations that are based on evidence and that pass constitutional muster. The evidence is huge. It's vast. The world's full of cannabis experts. So let's look at that so that we can have transparency and accountability. We want to be accountable, the government to be accountable. If they say I can only grow 3 plants, why? Why is 4 plants more harmful than 3 plants? Because you're scared I'm going to trade in the 4th plant, aren't you? I'm going to go sell a little banky on the side. And that would be awful. Why is it awful to trade in cannabis? Judge John Zondo even said, it states in the judgment, that trade, or dealing as they call it, in cannabis is a scourge in our society. No, it's not. So that's what the transparency and accountability is about. We need capable regulators. Now, those people who are to regulate cannabis should be those people who are involved with the plant already. But unfortunately, as I said in the beginning, we're just ordinary criminals. We're all still called criminals. The police are still arresting people. So the capable regulators are not going to come from our existing government at the moment. The capable regulators have to come from the cannabis community and from our South African cannabis experts, of which there are many. A little bit of foresight. Let's just stop, take a deep breath, and imagine what's going to happen in the future. A little bit of foresight. Let's use our South African history to give us that foresight. We call this the last apartheid law, because our government has had 25 years to sort out this Dagga business, and they've done nothing. It took 2 ordinary criminals to take them to court. So a bit of foresight could be built into these foundations of the Dagga regulations. Has to be relevant to our social context. We are not Canada. If we end up with laws and regulations that look like Canada, God help us. Really, relevance to the South African social context of Dagga being the last apartheid law. And how about a specific set of aims, okay? This looks like a business plan. What are we aiming to do here? We've got a foundation of regulation, of our principles for regulation. What should our aims be in doing this? And very, very simply put, because I could go along about this for ages, we need access to improved and affordable healthcare. People can grow their own medicine, but those people need to know how to grow their own medicine. People need to know how to administer their own medicine, so that it really can, on a primary healthcare level, the legalization of cannabis and the knowledge and the training that goes with it can really help in the access to affordable healthcare. A reduction to drug-related crime. Well, if you look at our somewhat shaky drug crime statistics in South Africa, they will tell you that so many gazillion people got arrested on crimes of drugs. But they don't even specify what drugs those are. And we can tell you that at least 96% of arrests for drugs are for cannabis. So a reduction in drug-related crime, because we take cannabis out of the prohibition sphere, okay? We regulate it sensibly, and that is where cannabis is the gateway drug, as Julian said. It can lead to more equitable, more evidence-based drug policy as a whole. So in that way, we can take the drugs out of the hands of the gangs, and we can put it into the hands of the regulators. We need to protect the young and vulnerable. Right now, a dealer does not ask for an ID. So we always get, well, what about the children? What about the children? Yes, well, more sensible drug policy will protect the young and the vulnerable, because it will change the playing field. We need to protect human rights, and we've discussed human rights already here today. It is my human right not to be incarcerated and locked up in a cage for something that I do in the privacy of my own mind. And we need to provide good value for money. Now, by this, I don't mean that weed should be cheap and you should be able to get the dankest weed for the cheapest price. I mean that these regulations cannot cost our already embattled government gazillions and gazillions of rand. Now, there's been, the odd little carrot has been dangled in Parliament. I believe Tito Mboweni mentioned it. I believe it's been mentioned by quite a few other high-profile people. But let's have a simple answer to cannabis regulation that doesn't break the bank.
Okay, so let's have a little look at what's going on right now. This is an infographic of what we believe is happening right now in South Africa. And remember, it's been happening for about 500 years. This is not new. It is a very, very vibrant underground market. It's worth billions. And it's very, very sophisticated. And of course it's organized crime. It couldn't be disorganized because it wouldn't survive. So it's survived 100 years of brutal prohibition. And all the time there is cannabis being ferried left, right, and center. Tons and tons of cannabis going to Windhoek every single day of the week because they don't grow it in Namibia. Someone's got to get it. Someone's got to take it. So don't think for 1 minute that this is a little small item on the agenda of South African society. This is a massive, massive underground project. In the bottom right-hand corner, we've got what we call the 4 platforms that we argue on. We don't personally argue them. That is for the legal team to argue. Responsible adult use, you may well know that as recreational. But we never use the word recreational because it's not recreation. We don't do this for fun. Every single time that I light one of these, it's for a purpose. I don't do it for fun. I do it because it assists my life. Traditional, cultural, and religious use is a huge, huge subject in South Africa concerning cannabis. There are more Rastafari in South Africa than most places in the world. We have this cultural use. We have traditional healers that use it for eons. So again, as Myrtle says, this is not California, it's not Colorado, it's not Uruguay, it's South Africa. There are no traditional healers in Toronto. So we have to make laws around such problems. The bottom right-hand corner, Myrtle mentioned 20 million cannabis users. That, I think, is more like, would you believe, personally, after doing all of my research for 8 years, I reckon 60% of this country use cannabis products on roughly a daily basis. I'll say it again. I personally think at least 60% of this country use cannabis products. Top left-hand corner, there are different methods of growing cannabis. If you want to get into the realms of medical cannabis and you want a bottle with a barcode on it that's the same cannabis day in, day out, you will have to grow cannabis in an extremely artificial environment, probably under a roof, probably with fans, probably with aircon machines, and probably totally automated to get a bog standard cloned product every single day, just like your bottle of paracetamol is. In Johannesburg, we put shade netting over our cannabis. We call it greenhouse cannabis because there are a lot of hailstones in Johannesburg. So we protect our plants not so much from natural predators. There are very few predators on an outdoor plant in an outdoor cannabis plant. This is mainly to do with the elements, not to do with all the hojos and things. Nothing really eats the cannabis plant except humans. The health aspects, we never call it medical. We do not use the word medical marijuana because we believe all cannabis is medicine. Whether you use it without a doctor's prescription or not, it's doing the same thing. And we've just spent 3 weeks doing a tour of the west coast of America, and thankfully, in every single dispensary we went to, there's just cannabis. If you are sick and you need some sort of guidance as to how to use cannabis for your particular ailment, there is a doctor on site to help you make a choice. But for me, after 42 years of regular cannabis use, I neither have a doctor or a medical aid or a hospital plan or anything. I just walk into the shop and I know exactly what I want, mostly because of the smell of it. So we never use the word medical or curing or medical marijuana. It is a health product. It's as simple as that. It makes you feel better. Right in the middle on the right-hand side, it says 900,000 farmers. We estimate there are 900,000 subsistence farmers in South Africa traditionally using cannabis products, mostly for feeding their livestock. Very few of those farmers go back home with a big bud and smoke it at night. It's different. And that original photograph that was taken that Myrtle showed you right at the beginning, nobody planted those plants. They've just been coming up for hundreds of years. They protect them from cattle so the cattle don't eat them until the winter. But none of that plant is actually smokable. Believe me, we went there and we tried. But what we did do is bring some of the seeds back with us, and we grew them in Johannesburg last year, and we've got a big secret to tell about those plants. It might not be any use as a recreational smoke, but my goodness me, has it got some incredible, incredible properties as medicine. And the Americans and the Canadians are just catching up with it now, because African sativas are extremely, extremely special plants.
So that's the current market and what it looks like. It's huge. There's different ways of growing it. There's different ways of using it. There's different ways of trading in it. But to get back to our principles of ethical regulation, this is possibly, sorry it's not very big, this is possibly our most important piece of court evidence. It is what is called the scale of harms. Now, our star witness in the trial of the plant is called Professor David Nutt, and he hails from Imperial College in London, and he holds the dubious honor of being the only academic to be fired from the UK government for saying that smoking cannabis is safer than riding a horse. So what he did was that he got a group of experts together, experts on all sorts of different drugs, and they came up with the scale of harms to work out on 3 different levels how harmful drugs are and to list them from the most harmful to the least harmful. So here we have the scale of the harms, and you can see on the right-hand side, there's a scale of overall harm, which is divided into harms to users and harms to others, harms to individual and the harms to society. And make no mistake, it was very, very, very clear in the research that the most harmful drug of all are those 2 that are legal. So what sits at the top of the list? Alcohol. What sits at the bottom of the list? Psilocybin mushrooms, which maybe you've all heard of, very common therapeutic and psychoactive fungus. So right down there, and I think it's number 7, is cannabis. So I go back to my first principle of the foundation for ethical regulation. You cannot regulate cannabis more harshly than alcohol. And thank goodness for us, we've got alcohol regulation already. And if you go out there into the world in South Africa, you will see that in proportion, there's not actually that much black market booze. There's quite a bit, okay, because there will always be an underground, unregulated market. But the alcohol regulations in South Africa are working quite well, okay, despite there's all sorts of, ways you could disagree with me on that, but generally speaking. But what's happening with the cannabis market? They're trying to impose plant quotas on us. They're trying to impose all sorts of really, really harsh regulations without weighing them up against the alcohol regulations. So even once we have finished with the cannabis issue, this diagram of the scale of harms and Professor David Nutt's evidence will be really, really important in regulating all drugs in the future.
It's a fine balance, though. Up until a year ago, if you look on the top left-hand corner of that diagram where the arrow is, that's where cannabis has been for over 100 years. A total blanket prohibition of the plant and a completely unregulated market. It is still an unregulated market because Mr. Zondo said you can't trade in it. So there's still a lot of unregulated trade. But what has happened since that judgment is, on the bottom scale, we have moved from the far left into the middle, into the orange. And at the bottom of the parabola, right in the center, you can imagine alcohol and tobacco being regulated as a societal norm. So cannabis is creeping into that orange band, and believe me, that judgment stopped thousands of people going to jail every day. Prior to that judgment, we believed 1,000 arrests a day were going on. And our statistics in our arrest helplines, they've gone more than quiet. So harm reduction has kicked in just because the government has stopped arresting small-time users. So it is a fine balance to get a societal norm. Remember, if the government get greedy and they don't give us what we want, we've already got $1 billion market in the underground that is doing all very nicely. We just want to come out into the open because we truly believe we can turn South Africa's economy around if you just leave us to it. So you could argue that because the government has put more and more taxation on a packet of cigarettes, the unregulated market in untaxed cigarettes is getting bigger and bigger. It's $50 for a packet of 20 taxed cigarettes, but it's R7 for a Zimbabwean import. It's no brainer. So the government, the more greedy they get, the more the unregulated market will kick in. So if there's anybody from the government here, just listen to that a moment, because we're going to take what we want anyway. We're not waiting for this government. It's not simple. All of those countries there are grappling with the same thing. Some is full prohibition, some is medical use, some is recreational use, some is decriminalized, some is legalized, some is a bit of everything. The point of this slide is there is no perfect legislation anywhere yet. It hasn't happened. 100 years of prohibition is a tough nut to crack and slide it into society as a whole. Even this slide is out of date because South Africa has this de facto blanket decriminalization of the use of cannabis. We absolutely fundamentally believe that we can lead the world in cannabis policy, because nowhere in the world is cannabis legalization fair and equitable at the moment.
So between Julian and I, we love poking the beast. So we, thanks to the joys of the internet, we made contact with lots of different drug policy NGOs around the world. And in 2016, we had our first foray to the United Nations. And we decided at our own expense, and through a bit of wangling and schmangling around, we managed to get admitted to the United Nations in New York. And we went as civil society representatives to the United Nations General Assembly's special session on drugs. Now, this special session on drugs had been touted for years. Oh, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. This big thing is going to happen, and the United Nations are going to change the world's drug policy. Well, it didn't happen. But we went to New York and we made absolutely invaluable connections with other civil society organizations. And we've been traveling overseas to do this ever since. Every year in March, there's something called the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is held in Vienna, Austria. And that is where all the civil society groups get together with the member states, and they discuss the world drug problem, as they call it. The world drug problem. Because the United Nations are very good in always stating everything in the negative. So over the last 3 years, there's been major shifts at the United Nations when it comes to cannabis. And that is not because the member states have suddenly become more enlightened. They haven't. It's very difficult to connect. As a member of civil society, it's very difficult to connect with your country representative when you're in Vienna. We had to chase those diplomats down the halls of Mordor, as we call it, because we call the United Nations building in Vienna Mordor. You have to chase them down and try and engage with them and say, well, do you really know what's happening? But we've had some success, and next year in March at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, they are going to look at reviewing cannabis schedules on an international level. We believe that they've overcomplicated the issue, but it will be very significant for South Africa as we move into a new era of cannabis regulation, that on an international level, things are also shifting quite significantly. And no longer can our government hide behind the 1961 conventions that prohibit all drugs. You can't hide behind that when it comes to cannabis anymore, because things are shifting on an international level. So one of the great outcomes that we had of all of this international travel was this document, which we collaborated with some European activists. And what it does is it takes these dreadful things called the Sustainable Development Goals. They always it takes that and it puts it into the cannabis context. Now, the SDGs, as we call them, are the ever-elusive goals. Because when we were in New York all those years ago, it was Sustainable Development Goals, I think, for 2015 or 2020 or something, and then the next minute, poof, they move the goals to 2030. So it's a lot of talk and a lot of hot air, but that is the language that the international drug policy community use, these Sustainable Development Goals. So we thought, let's meet them where they are, and let's take cannabis and the Sustainable Development Goals and see how this amazing plant can help towards the realization of those goals. So we took 25 of the SDGs, and we found 17 of those 25 could actually be attainable through the legal regulation of cannabis. So that is what this booklet is all about. And luckily, it was one of the big cannabis companies sponsored the printing of it in the Czech Republic, and I have some copies to sell when we put up our little stall a bit later. So that is our work on an international level. And I think that you've got to poke this beast from all different angles, although the work in the United Nations is somewhat frustrating. So what do we want? We've got this international thing, we've got this situation in South Africa with 900,000 farmers, 20 million users approximately. So how do we even start knowing what we want? So what we've decided is we'll break it down into its simplest form, the regulations that we want. So in the top left-hand corner, it all starts with putting a seed in the ground. So it starts with the growers, the cultivators, the farmers. What are those farmers' responsibilities? What type of cannabis farmers do you get? Because it's not just a case of put the seed in the ground, grow the plant. It's not like a millie. There's millions of different uses of cannabis. So it starts with the farmers and the different types of farmers. Then probably the most important part of the regulations is what we would like to call hubs, or what's more traditionally called co-ops. But the idea of a hub is not exactly the same as a co-op, so we prefer to use the word hub. And this is where self-regulation comes in. Because we are not going to have it that those people that have been oppressing us for the last 100 years now come and tell us what to do. So we've tried as far as possible to develop a model that calls for self-regulation. Because as underground cannabis users, cultivators, and traders, we know how to organize ourselves. And these hubs already exist in South Africa, thousands of them, where farmers come together and they organize quality control. They organize their members so that everybody knows who everybody else is. And the hubs of the future can also include things like quality control to scientific standards. It can also have a certain amount of taxation at source. And if you tax us too much on our cannabis, we will just go straight back to the black market, like is happening in California. In California, the tax on cannabis is 45%, and the black market, the unregulated market, is thriving. But hubs could take care of all of these kind of administrative jobs around the use and trade and cultivation of cannabis. Then from the hub, the cannabis needs to be distributed, and from the distribution network, it needs to land up in some sort of a retail context. So that is our simple diagram of what we want the regulation of cannabis to look like. If you take Julian's diagram of what the current cannabis market looks like, and you put it next to what we want in terms of legal regulation, the two fit in really nicely. We don't need a top-down imposition of over-regulation in South Africa. It's just not going to work. So look at the existing market, find something that is simple, doable, sustainable, enforceable, and there you get that perfect fit.
It's complicated, isn't it? Right. Who thinks that they need a license to grow cannabis? Who wants to grow cannabis with a license? No? Anybody? Was anybody foolish enough to get into bed with their government? Because that's what's going to happen. If anybody thinks they need a license to grow a plant, you're not thinking straight. And if anybody thinks they want to get into bed with the South African government, then you've got to have rocks in your head. It's not going well in Lesotho. Everybody now knows that the headline said, medical marijuana legal in Lesotho. It couldn't be further from the truth. When you dissect that, it means 12 licenses have been issued in Lesotho. Last year, the licenses were 50,000 rand. This morning, a license is 50 million rand. There are only two companies growing cannabis in Lesotho. All the others are just trading in licenses. They've got no intention of growing any weed. The license is the commodity now. How about this lady? The Deputy Minister of Transport. Oh, dearie me, her husband was stopped at Maziru border with 5 tons of weed in a false bottom in his truck. It's polluted. Licensing never ends well when there are human beings involved. But it's not just Africa. This is the mayor of Massachusetts who just got fired for taking $600,000 in bribes for cannabis licenses. And 1 year into legalization in Canada, it's actually 1 year today, it's the 1 year birthday today of legalization in Canada. There are 11 licensed producers in Canada. 4 of them are already being indicted for malpractice. 3 lawsuits, 3 class actions are coming up in the courts of Canada. So we just take that as a pinch of salt. If anybody wants, look, licenses aren't going away. The government is hell-bent on dishing out licenses. And we would say, if you want to grow medical cannabis with a barcode on to put in the discount, you're going to have to jump through their hoops. But the other horrible thing about that is you're going to wear latex gloves and a white suit and a face mask for the rest of your life. Do you really want to grow weed like that? Be my guest, but we are going to make sure that we are not criminalized and the other 20 million cannabis users for not wanting to fit into their system. That's the most important part of licensing. None of it sits well with us because every time we have lit one of these, for all of my adult life, I've risked my liberty. And 3 times I've been in South African jails in the last 20 years because of this. So none of this sits well. How dare the government think that they can turn around and say, okay, everything's cool by the pool now, never mind about the children and schizophrenia, we just want the tax. Well, to hell with it. We're going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that that doesn't happen. And what about this? What about the people with squadzillions of rand to turn into licenses? That is what 59 people look like in 30 beds. That is the awaiting trial block in Westville Maximum Security Jail in September last year. And the main problem with these guys is they just don't have any bail money. The only reason most of them are awaiting trial is because they don't have anyone or anything to back them up to get out there so they can defend themselves. What about those guys? What about these guys? Those guys were growing 4 kilograms of weed on their plot in Port Shepstone 2 years ago. They've been there ever since. They've never opened their mouths in mitigation. They've never been given a chance to defend themselves. They're 4 of millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people in South Africa lost in the system. They've got Dagga couple t-shirts on. We send them food parcels. We've done a presentation on their farm with their wives and 4 children between them, and we gave them all the door money. It's the least we could do. But we're just 2 people with a couple of admin staff. There's hundreds of people like this. We're swamped with the harms of prohibition. So if you think for 1 minute you've got millions around for a license, just take a deep breath and think of the consequences of that, because if you want a license right now in South Africa, you're only thinking about yourself.
When people come up to us and they say, oh, I'm going to go and grow a whole lot of weed in the Eastern Cape, they will say, it's not about growing the cannabis. It's actually more about the support industries. The cannabis culture in South Africa, as I said, was 500 years old. Okay? We've only had prohibition for the last 100 years. There are enough cannabis farmers. We don't need Canadians and Israelis and rich South Africans and whatever to suddenly start putting seeds in the ground. We don't need that. What we need is support. And cannabis, by its very nature, opens the playing field wide, wide, wide to hundreds of different support industries. And that is where you're going to score. That is where you're going to make your money. Take your nose out of our business. We know what we're doing. We need security experts. This is South Africa. Somebody's going to want to come and steal your Dagga or steal your money you've made from your Dagga. So what about the cannabis security industry? What about quality control? Quality control is a big issue. Yes, we want to have a safe product going to market. Just because we don't want licenses doesn't mean to say that it's going to be a free-for-all with people producing the famous snake oil or people producing cannabis that is full of pesticides and molds and all sorts of ugly things, okay? Just remember that nobody's ever died from cannabis, but quality control is a really, really important thing. We need people coming in and establishing testing stations. What about these foreigners with all their money to come and invest in the South African cannabis industry, developing mobile testing stations that can go all the way around to the rural areas and test people's weed for its quality and its purity and its safety? Cannabis education. We went and did a workshop with a whole lot of traditional healers in Mpumalanga, and we were absolutely horrified that the middle-aged healers, not the young ones and not the old ones, have little or no knowledge of cannabis cultivation. Because it's always been an underground thing that was just incidental, that you used that medicine that was grown far in valleys. We need an enormous amount of support when it comes to cannabis education in South Africa, all the way from our top oncologists and specialists, all the way down to our traditional healers on the ground, to our people who are providing adult use cannabis, to our people who are producing industrial cannabis for things like biogas digesters and fabrics and all the rest of it. So if you're in the education business, get into education and training, develop online courses. I know I'm running out of time. What about our environment? We don't want our cannabis to add to our environmental woes. Really, we need it to help. So what about these foreigners who are wanting to come in and grow all this indoor cannabis? We don't have enough electricity. So don't come and grow too much cannabis under lights. It's really going to harm our environment. What about caregivers? People talk about medical cannabis and the doctors prescribing it. What about people who can grow cannabis for other people, for a group of patients in a closed-loop system? Scientific research. Cannabis just happens to be the most researched plant on the planet, but as far as South African research is concerned, there's very, very little of it. Unfortunately, research permits were given out in the late 1990s, and nothing was ever done of it, because all the people who got the research permits did was use it to ride on the coattails of their fame. Oh, I've got a research permit. Meantime, they never did the research. So there's a lot, we really are lagging behind on research on South African cannabis. We need to think about workers' rights within the cannabis industry, particularly seeing as there is going to be this reality of medical-grade cannabis being grown and those companies employing South African workers. So we need the trade unions to also have the knowledge on how to look after the workers' rights in the cannabis industry. Dagga tourism, this is one of our favorite things. We don't need the Canadians and the Israelis coming here to come and grow cannabis. We need them to come here to smoke our cannabis. We need 420, as we call it, because that's a code for cannabis. We need 420-friendly guest houses and tourism operators and travel agents, and that is where the foreign currency is going to come in our book. Because when we speak about cannabis in South Africa, when we go overseas, everybody's really, really excited about coming to our beautiful country and smoking our beautiful weed. And then what about our neighbors? There's a hell of a lot of support that's needed in communicating what's happening to South Africa and our neighboring countries. And a lot of our neighboring countries are either mired in corrupt licenses like Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, Malawi, or otherwise our neighbors are stuck in the 15th century, like places like Namibia and Botswana, who still have the death penalty. So these are just 6 areas of support industries.
So a lot of people think that legalization means a free-for-all. Well, we have a free-for-all right now. There are no rules. It is free-for-all. So we're talking about the legalized regulation, and we need regulation in our lives. I personally hate regulation. For 40 years of being in the underground in the cannabis world, we haven't dealt with regulation very well whatsoever. So it's kind of a new concept to us as well. This is a picture of the biggest cannabis gathering in the world. 150,000 people lit a joint at exactly the same time in Vancouver in March this year, but they were permitted to do it. This is a public place and they got a permit. We went through the whole of the west coast of America last month. You can buy cannabis all over the place, but there's nowhere to smoke it. You can't find a place to smoke weed anywhere unless you're in your house. So we need some sort of regulation as to where to use it. What about an age limit? I don't care, I'm 60. Work it out between you, 18, 21, 25. Some places in America are 19, which is quite arbitrary. But anyway, that's the small print, but there has to be some sort of societal norm. If it's 18 for an evil killer like alcohol, then well, let's leave it at 18 then. What about driving? It doesn't really concern you guys because you don't use cannabis products, but I've been an enemy of the state for the last 40 years as an adult driver. I smoke weed, I drive to a place like this. If they tested my blood, I would be criminalized for the use of cannabis products behind the wheel of a car. That does not sit well with me either. Myrtle touched on the transportation of it. We need people with transportation companies, because the transportation of cannabis anywhere outside here in legalized states, all of the trucks are targeted. You can put $20 million worth of cannabis in the back of a 16-wheeler. There's got to be some sort of protection somewhere. What about storage? You grow a year's worth of weed, you need to store it somewhere. That's what we were doing when we were busted. We grew a year's worth of weed for 2 people. It was over a kilogram. We smoke loads of weed, we give even more away. So what about the storage facilities? How are they going to operate? And the biggest one of all, that insidious business of somebody out there wanting to know what's in your bodily fluids. Damn it. That's my worst one of all. How dare anybody want to test me to find out what's in my blood? I will never, and I shall never, and I never have worked for anybody who was interested in what was in my urine. Looking to the future.
So this is how we've got our work cut out for us. We've got no choice. We have to engage with the government. Anybody like to take over with engaging with the government? It's not a great prospect, but we're going to, as civil society, we're going to have to do it. We have to protect cannabis culture, because that is what is going to take this whole thing forward and make South Africa flourish. Not medicine, not licenses, but cannabis culture. We have to somehow put the Ubuntu, save the Ubuntu in cannabis. We have to harness technology. If you go down to the Eastern Cape to Ponderland, you park your car, you have to walk 3-4 hours across some rivers and up some hills to find all of these hidden away cannabis fields. When you get there, there's a smartphone. So we have to embrace 21st century culture, 21st century technology when it comes to regulating cannabis. All the apps and gizmos and everything that we need. We have to keep it in the 21st century and not go backwards with this old 20th century licensing system. We just have to look at general drug policy. It cannot possibly stop at cannabis. We've already got privacy. And I'm sure if tested in the Constitutional Court, we'll get privacy for things like psilocybin mushrooms and LSD and MDMA and all of those things. But let's just take it slowly and let's just educate people along the way. We need to look at this whole international picture. We need to look at the United Nations conventions preventing our use, trade, and cultivation of cannabis and other drugs, and we need to pay attention on an international level. A lot of people in South Africa have got no idea what goes on in the UN. And love them or hate them, it is important. They might all be old white men running the world, but it is significant. And then my personal favorite, we need to use cannabis to create some sort of gender equality and some sort of empowerment and advancement of women in the workplace. It sounds idealistic, but it's absolutely essential, and we've got the perfect place now to advance this whole gender equality issue.
So very quickly, how you can help us. We've got a very vibrant social media system now. We've had to. We can use it. It's been working to our favor. We've got 58, nearly 60,000 people on a Facebook page. We use that to promote all our all of our affiliate programs, all of our ticketing for all of our events. We've got a very vibrant YouTube channel. Every week we have a 2-hour cannabis culture show called The Hot Box Show. Please subscribe to it and learn who we are, because we come in peace. Twitter is where we have our opinions. It is where the adults are. We retweet general drug policy, and if you want an opinion of the Dagga couples, you'll find it on Twitter. And we have a very personal journey on Instagram. There's no policy here, there's no freebies. It's just pictures of Myrtle and I traveling the world doing this crazy job. Please go to the Fields of Green for All website. It is a treasure trove of information. We're very proud of it. Within it, you will find the Green Network, which is a pay portal. There are hundreds of people paying 49 rand a month to keep this beast afloat now, to pay for diesel to get to places like this. We're not alone. There are traditional healers and Rastafari and development councils all over the country coming under the umbrella of the Fields of Green banner. And all of these people, they're not waiting for legalization. These are our affiliate companies. They're trading, they're online, they're exporting, and my battery just died. Ding.
So,
We're not taking any questions because you lot just grandstand the whole thing. Go on, grandstand then.
No, I'm a healthcare provider. 40
I
years.
can't hear you.
I'm a healthcare provider. I'm a healthcare provider, and I'm a father. And I see one big flaw in what you're trying to promote. I understand what you're trying to promote, but the one thing you can't control is dose.
Is what?
Is dosage. And the use of Dagga and what it leads to is dose dependent, just like alcohol is. I have a 21-year-old daughter who's a drug addict, okay? She was introduced to drugs through Dagga, no question. Now, what do you say to a father like me who has spent hundreds of thousands of rands on rehabilitation, as a daughter who has no self-confidence and no self-esteem? What do you say?
Well,
so I understand what you're trying to do, but
what I will say to you, sir...
alcohol is not an evil drug. Alcohol is used in small quantities, is good for you. Okay, but it's dose dependent, just like Dagga is. So your regulations, how are they going to make provision for people using Dagga within the appropriate dosages?
All the way through the history of the use of entheogens, there has always been a vulnerable minority of people. And I would suggest that your daughter's issue with substance abuse does not have anything to do with the substance at all. It's to do with some sort of trauma that happened in her life to get her to that position. So don't for 1 minute blame Dagga for her problems. Now, what about the 300 million people around the world that use cannabis products on a daily basis with no problem whatsoever? What we're trying to do is protect people like your daughter with a legalized, regulated system, because your daughter couldn't cry out for help because she was so stigmatized it went wrong at the wrong time. So, if cannabis was acceptable in society, your daughter could cry for help and nobody would throw her in a jail for a weekend for her to dry out first.
I understand exactly what you're saying, but she was led into it by a young man.
Oh, well.
So how do you stop?
Yeah, okay. Look, we could go on ad infinitum about this. I'm sorry that your daughter has an issue with the use of substances. Other people do in other parts of the world. But why criminalize me for those people's problems? Anybody else for shaving? Yeah. Yep.
yeah, sorry, we kind of like went on for a bit long.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. I don't want this to degenerate into an emotional exchange. Medi Saga Sativa, would you like to regulate that as well?
What?
The what?
It's called lucerne. It's similar to marijuana, cannabis. It is a perennial flowering plant.
Did you say lucerne?
Yes.
What about it?
I've just given you the technical term for lucerne, and I'm saying, why do you want to actually regulate a product? You're in an audience that looks towards natural outcomes.
Oh, I see. I see.
I agree.
Need for regulation. Just leave it alone. It's a commodity.
Yes. No, I'll do it.
And
Fine.
just let society spontaneously order itself around it.
I couldn't.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with you. If we had our way, we would have, just free the weed, as it were. But I think that we need to be realistic in South Africa, because there's no way we can make the leap from full prohibition to no regulation. It's just asking too much.
My first question was exactly going to be that. Why regulate it all?
Yeah.
The second is just a point around the use of cannabis at work and on the road. And, well, then why not have alcohol at work and alcohol on the road? I, for one, like to have a couple of beers while I'm driving. It doesn't harm anybody except the guy I crash into.
Because you don't get drunk from cannabis. See, the thing is that there's a misperception about impairment because of lack of knowledge of the plant. And our big thing with testing drivers and testing people at work is they need to prove impairment. And the only way that you can prove impairment is with a cognitive test. You cannot prove impairment because of the nature of cannabis as a substance and the way that a person becomes impaired. You cannot prove impairment by testing somebody's bodily fluids. It's just not the same thing. The one thing that you can do is there's some mouth swabs that have been developed that will tell you how long ago the cannabis was consumed. But that's only for smoking. What about the person who takes oil, cannabis oil, which sits in your body for at least 28 days? If you test their bodily fluids, they're not impaired, but they've got cannabis in their system. So we need the clever people to develop a test for impairment, and then we're not there yet.
There's another thing I'd like to put in the mix there when you talk about alcohol in driving and cannabis in driving. If for any reason I think that I've had far too much weed, I know I've had far too much weed. I don't drive. I have a cup of coffee and hang out. But the last thing you do is hit a huge fat vat of weed and get in a car. You smoke cannabis, you socialize, you have a coffee, and when you're ready to go, you go. But you ever try stopping someone who's pissed, getting in a car, going, "Yeah, brew, I'm okay. Leave me alone, I'm cool." You can't tell them anything. And that is the difference between cannabis intoxicating and alcohol intoxication.
Do you feel everybody feels the same way about that?
Pardon?
'Cause I'm fine when I drink. Fine to drive.
That usually is the case.
That's
Yeah.
entirely true. I think in 40 years in South Africa, things have changed dramatically with the stigma of drinking and driving.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, are you aware of any countries in the world where cannabis is completely unregulated?
North Korea. And North Korea and Iran. But in Iran, you only become criminalized if you consume it by igniting it, because that's when it metabolizes into a psychoactive substance. So if you're cultivating it for shirts, or you're cultivating it for seed for nutrition, then you are not illegal in Iran. But yeah, North Korea and Iran are the only two places that have really walked away from it. Pardon?
Costa Rica's been captured by the Canadians.
Most of
licenses.
Most of Central and Southern America now has got colonialism version 3 running, just as we're getting it here right now.
Okay, one more question.
One more question, and then before we come in. In lunchtime, over cigarette.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I work as a nursing sister in a long-term rehab facility. Okay. And what we've seen a lot in the last couple of years is a massive increase of young people coming in with weed psychosis, resulting from just the use of THC, because the way THC has been developing recently is more accessible, you're not going to be arrested. So 2 points. First point is weed psychosis, especially with people with underlying mental health issues, is a massively growing problem and needs a lot more education. Secondly, why on earth does the government keep insisting on sending weed growers to rehabs?
Exactly. You know, there's...
If that could be challenged, I would be, yeah. It helps no one.
What we find with speaking to particularly young people and the issue of weed psychosis is that it's a desperate measure to try and get away from the SSRIs and that kind of medication that seems to make them feel awful. So they self-medicate with cannabis. And maybe with not the right strain, maybe with too much or whatever. And that all comes down to drug education in schools. Because all of us were brought up with Steve the addict coming into school and showing you that video of a fried egg saying, this is your brain on drugs. And then when people find out with things like cannabis that your brain is not fried by using cannabis, they think that the drug education lied about everything. So that this whole skewed perception, cannabis psychosis, particularly in young people, is a prevalent thing, and we can only do that with yeah. And then also the growers who end up in rehabs, it all comes down to the police quota system, and then this system of allowing people who get caught to go to a harm reduction program instead of going to jail or getting a criminal record. Which just harms the people who are there, and it makes the treatment for the people who really need it stretched thin amongst everybody. So none of it makes any sense. Yeah, good point. Thank you.